The mansion's grand entrance echoed with three simultaneous screams that could shatter crystal. Inside the marble foyer, another nanny stood frozen, her designer bag clutched against her chest like armor, as three identical toddlers unleashed a symphony of chaos that had driven away 7 caregivers before her. Within 20 minutes of her arrival, she too would join the exodus, leaving behind only the fading click of her heels against Italian marble and the relentless wails of 3 inconsolable children. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Whitmore estate sprawled across 15 acres of perfectly manicured grounds in the heart of Connecticut's Gold Coast, where old money whispered through centuries-old oak trees and privacy came at a premium measured in millions. To passing drivers on the winding country road, the Georgian colonial mansion represented the American dream realized, white columns rising majestically against red brick, windows gleaming like diamonds in their perfectly aligned rows, and gardens that belonged in European palaces rather than New England countryside. Yet behind those pristine walls lived a reality that no amount of wealth could remedy. 3 18-month-old boys, Michael, Matthew, and Marcus, had transformed what should have been a palace of joy into a fortress of exhaustion and despair. Their father, James Whitmore, stood as one of Manhattan's most formidable corporate attorneys, a man whose commanding presence in boardrooms had sealed billion-dollar mergers and whose reputation for ruthless precision had earned both respect and fear throughout Wall Street's elite circles. But corporate sharks and hostile takeovers paled in comparison to the challenge that awaited him each evening when his chauffeur-driven sedan pulled through the iron gates of his estate. The same voice that commanded attention in courtrooms now trembled with helplessness as 3 pairs of identical blue eyes stared up at him with needs he couldn't fulfill and tears he couldn't stop. James had built his fortune on control, on the ability to anticipate every variable and counter every argument. His penthouse office overlooked Central Park from the 42nd floor, where leather-bound law books lined mahogany shelves and crystal decanters caught afternoon sunlight like captured rainbows. Senators sought his counsel, Fortune 500 CEOs requested his representation, and federal judges respected his arguments. In that world of power suits and calculated strategies, James Whitmore was untouchable. The triplets had arrived during what should have been the pinnacle of his success. His wife, Catherine, had glowed with maternal anticipation as her belly swelled with their precious cargo. They had converted the mansion's entire east wing into a nursery wonderland, 3 matching cribs crafted from Brazilian rosewood, walls painted in soothing pastels that cost more per gallon than most people's monthly salary, and every conceivable luxury that money could purchase for their unborn sons. Catherine had dreamed of afternoon tea parties in the garden, of teaching 3 little boys to ride horses in the private stable, of Christmas mornings filled with laughter echoing through rooms that had known only adult conversations for too long. She had hired architects to design a playground that resembled something from a fairy tale, complete with towers and bridges and slides that would make any theme park envious. The delivery had gone exactly as planned. 3 healthy boys, each weighing precisely 6 pounds and 12 ounces, with 10 perfect fingers and 10 perfect toes, lungs that announced their arrival to the entire maternity ward, and faces that bore the unmistakable Whitmore chin that had graced family portraits for generations. James had stood in the hospital room, his usually steady hands trembling as he held his sons for the first time, feeling a love so overwhelming it threatened to buckle his knees. For 6 blissful months, the Whitmore household had hummed with the rhythms of new parenthood. Catherine proved to be a natural mother, moving between the boys with an intuitive grace that amazed the small army of staff hired to assist with their care. She seemed to understand each child's unique personality, even in those early months. Michael's contemplative nature, Matthew's adventurous spirit, and Marcus's sensitive soul that required extra gentleness. James had restructured his entire practice to spend more time at home, delegating cases that would have normally demanded his personal attention and conducting client meetings via video conference from his home office. Evenings found him in the nursery, reading legal briefs while 3 babies cooed from their matching rockers, occasionally glancing up to catch Catherine humming lullabies as she folded tiny clothes or prepared bottles with the precision of a pharmaceutical chemist. The house staff had adjusted to the new rhythms with professional efficiency. Mrs. Rodriguez, the head housekeeper who had managed the estate for over a decade, coordinated schedules and supervised the additional help hired specifically for childcare duties. The kitchen operated around the clock, preparing specialized formulas and sterilizing bottles with military precision. Even the groundskeeping staff found themselves working quieter hours to avoid disturbing nap times. But fate, as James would learn with devastating clarity, recognized no boundaries of wealth or preparation. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning in early October, when autumn leaves painted the estate grounds in shades of gold and crimson that Catherine had planned to show the boys during their afternoon stroll. She had left the house early for a routine medical appointment, her car navigating the familiar winding road that connected their private world to the outside. A delivery truck, its driver distracted by his phone, ran a red light at the intersection where Maple Street met Highway 7. The call came while James sat in his office reviewing a contract for a pharmaceutical merger. His secretary's voice carried a tremor he had never heard before, as she stammered words that seemed to rearrange themselves into meaningless sounds. Hospital, emergency room, critical condition, please come immediately. Catherine never regained consciousness. The doctors explained with clinical precision about traumatic brain injuries and the limitations of modern medicine, but their words bounced off James like rain against reinforced glass. He sat beside her bed for 3 days, holding her hand and whispering about the boys waiting at home, about the playground that still needed her approval for the final color selections, about the family portraits they had scheduled for Christmas. When the machines finally fell silent, James felt something fundamental break inside his chest, a fracture that seemed to extend through every carefully constructed wall he had built around his emotions. The funeral drew hundreds of mourners, colleagues who had never seen him display anything beyond professional courtesy, clients who respected his legal brilliance, and society figures who knew the Whitmore name from charity galas and polo matches. But in the days that followed, as the black-clad crowds dispersed and sympathy cards filled his mailbox, James discovered that grief was not a case that could be won through preparation and strategy. It was a living thing that consumed rational thought and left him staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror at 3 in the morning, wondering how to explain to 3 18-month-old boys why their mother would never sing them to sleep again. The first nanny arrived with credentials that read like a resume for the White House domestic staff. Margaret Thornton had managed households for ambassadors and celebrities, her references spanning decades of flawless service in the most demanding environments. She wore crisp uniforms and spoke in measured tones about schedules and developmental milestones, carrying herself with the authority of someone accustomed to managing chaos through sheer force of organization. Margaret lasted exactly 14 hours. The trouble began during the boys' first meal under her supervision. What had once been a choreographed dance of bottles and bibs and patient coaxing became a battlefield of flying food and inconsolable screaming. Michael threw his bottle across the room with the precision of a major league pitcher. Matthew upended his bowl of pureed carrots onto the Persian rug that had cost more than most people's cars. Marcus simply stared at her with tear-filled eyes and opened his mouth in a wail that seemed to emerge from the depths of his soul. Margaret tried every technique in her considerable arsenal. She adjusted feeding schedules, modified room temperatures, experimented with different formulas, and attempted various soothing methods that had worked with dozens of other children. But the triplets remained immune to her expertise, their crying intensifying with each failed attempt at comfort. By evening, when James returned from the office to find Margaret pacing the nursery with dark circles under her eyes and formula stains on her previously immaculate uniform, he knew the situation was untenable. She approached him with the defeated posture of someone who had encountered a challenge that defied all professional experience. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, her voice hoarse from hours of attempting to project calm authority over the sound of crying, "I must be honest with you. In 23 years of childcare, I have never encountered children who are so resistant to comfort. They seem to be experiencing a level of distress that goes beyond normal adjustment difficulties." James nodded, though something cold settled in his stomach. "What are you saying exactly?" Margaret chose her words carefully, her professional training warring with her natural compassion. "Children this young are remarkably intuitive about emotional atmospheres. They can sense when their primary caregiver is struggling, even if that person isn't physically present. The boys may be responding to the profound change in their environment, the absence of their mother's presence, in ways that make them essentially unreachable through conventional caregiving methods." She paused, gathering courage for her next words. "I believe they require someone with very specialized experience in trauma-informed childcare, perhaps someone with background in pediatric psychology or grief counseling. My skills, considerable though they may be in normal circumstances, are simply inadequate for their current needs." By morning, Margaret had packed her bags and departed with the same quiet efficiency that had marked her arrival. James stood in the foyer, watching her sedan disappear down the tree-lined drive, while upstairs the boys' crying continued like a soundtrack to his failure. The second nanny came recommended by the city's most exclusive placement agency, specializing in high-net-worth families with complex needs. Dr. Elizabeth Carrington held advanced degrees in child psychology and early childhood development, her academic credentials spanning institutions from Harvard to Oxford. She arrived with detailed questionnaires about the family's routines, psychological assessment tools, and a philosophy rooted in attachment theory and behavioral modification. Dr. Carrington approached the situation with scientific methodology, observing the boys' behaviors and documenting their responses to various stimuli in a leather-bound notebook that she carried like a medical chart. She adjusted lighting levels, introduced classical music, modified feeding positions, and implemented what she termed structured comfort interventions, designed to help the children process their grief in developmentally appropriate ways. Her approach, while theoretically sound, proved equally ineffective against the wall of despair that seemed to surround the triplets. Michael developed what she clinically termed feeding aversion, refusing bottles with the determination of a hunger striker. Matthew began engaging in repetitive behaviors, banging his small fists against his crib railings until his knuckles were raw. Marcus retreated into what appeared to be a depressive state, lying motionless in his crib with eyes that seemed to stare through the ceiling towards something no one else could see. Dr. Carrington lasted 3 days, her scientific objectivity gradually eroding under the relentless pressure of inconsolable children and her own inability to provide relief. She left behind detailed notes about complicated grief responses in pre-verbal children and recommendations for pediatric psychiatrists who might be better equipped to address what she termed a complex psychological situation beyond the scope of traditional childcare. The third nanny specialized in multiple births, arriving with stories of successfully managing quadruplets and quintuplets for celebrity families whose names appeared regularly in gossip magazines. Linda Morrison carried an arsenal of multitasking techniques, synchronized feeding schedules, and efficient diaper-changing systems that promised to restore order through sheer logistical precision. She managed 18 hours before the isolation defeated her. Linda had expected challenges related to coordination and time management, but she was unprepared for the emotional weight that seemed to permeate every room of the mansion. The boys' crying had evolved beyond simple distress calls into something that sounded like mourning, as if they understood on some cellular level that their world had fundamentally changed. The fourth nanny, Susan Chen, brought 15 years of experience with children from difficult backgrounds, including foster children and those who had experienced early trauma. She recognized immediately that the triplets were not simply difficult babies but children processing loss in the only way available to them, Her gentle approach and trauma-informed techniques showed initial promise, with brief moments when one or another of the boys would quiet under her ministrations. But even Susan's specialized skills proved insufficient against the depth of the boys' distress.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After 5 days of minimal sleep and emotional exhaustion that left her questioning her career choice, she tearfully explained to James that the children needed more intensive intervention than any single caregiver could provide. The 5th and 6th nannies followed in rapid succession, each arriving with different philosophies and techniques, each departing with the same bewildered expression of professional defeat. One specialized in sleep disorders, convinced that establishing proper rest patterns would resolve the behavioral issues. Another focused on nutrition, theorizing that the boys' distress stemmed from digestive problems or formula allergies. The 7th nanny, Patricia Walsh, had worked with children of deployed military personnel and those who had lost parents in combat. She understood grief and its impact on young minds, approaching the boys with a combination of firmness and compassion that had helped dozens of other children navigate similar losses. But even her battle-tested techniques met with limited success, as the triplets seemed to exist in a bubble of inconsolable sorrow that resisted all attempts at penetration. By the time the 8th nanny arrived, the Whitmore household had developed a reputation within the childcare community. Word spread through professional networks about the impossible assignment at the Connecticut estate, where 3 beautiful boys seemed determined to remain unreachable, and a grieving widower grew more desperate with each failed attempt at normalcy. Rebecca Foster came highly recommended by a placement agency that specialized in crisis situations. She had managed households during divorces, deaths, and family scandals that made tabloid headlines. Her no-nonsense approach and ability to maintain professional boundaries in emotionally charged environments made her seem like the ideal candidate for a family struggling with extraordinary circumstances. Rebecca arrived on a Monday morning with military-style efficiency, immediately implementing structured routines designed to provide stability and predictability for children experiencing trauma. She established feeding schedules, nap times, and play periods with the precision of a general organizing troops. Her philosophy centered on the belief that consistency and firm boundaries would eventually break through the boys' resistance. For the first few hours, her confidence seemed justified. The boys appeared slightly less agitated under her structured approach, their crying reduced from constant to intermittent. Rebecca moved between them with practiced efficiency, changing diapers, preparing bottles, and maintaining the nursery with systematic precision. But as the day wore on, the familiar pattern emerged. Michael began refusing his bottle, turning his head away with determined persistence. Matthew escalated from fussing to full-throated screaming that echoed through the mansion's halls. Marcus retreated into the listless state that had become his signature response to stress, lying in his crib with the stillness of someone far older than his 18 months. By evening, Rebecca's crisp confidence had wilted under the relentless pressure. She found herself standing in the nursery, surrounded by crying children and the wreckage of another failed day, her structured approach proving no more effective than any of her predecessors' techniques. That night, as James returned from another abbreviated day at the office, he found Rebecca sitting in the kitchen with Mrs. Rodriguez, both women looking like soldiers after a particularly brutal battle. The sound of crying drifted down from the second floor, a familiar soundtrack that had become the mansion's constant companion. "Mr. Whitmore," Rebecca began, her professional composure cracking slightly, "I need to be honest about the situation upstairs. These children are not responding to any conventional caregiving approaches. They seem to be locked in a pattern of distress that goes beyond normal grief or adjustment difficulties." She paused, choosing her words with care. "In my experience, children who have suffered this type of early loss sometimes require very specialized intervention. The boys appear to be waiting for something or someone specific, though I cannot determine what that might be. They're not simply crying from hunger or discomfort, they're mourning, and they're doing it in the only way available to them."
James felt the familiar tightness in his chest that had become his constant companion since Catherine's death. "What are you recommending?" Rebecca's answer came with visible reluctance. "I think you may need to consider residential treatment or specialized foster care with families trained in pediatric trauma. The boys need more intensive intervention than any single caregiver can provide in a home environment, no matter how well equipped." The suggestion hit James like a physical blow. The idea of separating from his sons, of admitting that his love and resources were insufficient to help them heal, felt like another death in a family that had already suffered too much loss. He thanked Rebecca for her honesty, but something in his expression made clear that he was not ready to consider such drastic measures. By morning, Rebecca had packed her bags and joined the growing list of caregivers who had been defeated by 3 small boys and their bottomless well of sorrow. The mansion fell into a routine of desperate improvisation. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose housekeeping duties had never included childcare, found herself pressed into service as a temporary caregiver, while James frantically contacted placement agencies and interviewed potential candidates over video calls. The other household staff pitched in where they could, but none possessed the specialized training needed for such a complex situation. James reduced his office hours to a bare minimum, working from home whenever possible and delegating cases that would have normally required his personal attention. His partners at the law firm, while sympathetic to his situation, began expressing concerns about clients who specifically requested his services and cases that needed his particular expertise. The boys' crying had taken on different characteristics that reflected their individual personalities. Michael's sobs were angry, filled with a fury that seemed directed at the world for taking his mother away. Matthew's cries were desperate, pleading sounds that seemed to ask why no one could make things right again. Marcus had developed a heartbreaking whimper that sounded like resignation, as if he had accepted that comfort was no longer possible. During quiet moments, usually late at night when exhaustion temporarily silenced the household, James would stand in the nursery doorway and watch his sons sleep. Their faces, peaceful in slumber, bore such strong resemblances to Catherine that his chest would tighten with grief so intense it threatened to bring him to his knees. He could see her eyes in Michael's determined expression, her smile in Matthew's even while sleeping, her gentle nature in Marcus's peaceful features. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of their situation. Friends who had once filled the mansion with laughter and conversation found excuses to avoid visits, uncomfortable with the constant crying and unsure how to offer meaningful support. Business associates expressed sympathy, but seemed relieved when meetings moved back to James's office or neutral locations. Even the household staff, loyal though they were, began showing signs of strain. The gardening crew worked with noise-canceling headphones to block out the crying. The kitchen staff prepared meals with mechanical efficiency, their usual conversations replaced by the tense quiet of people walking on eggshells. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had managed the estate with warmth and humor for over a decade, moved through her duties with the grim determination of someone fighting a war of attrition. The mansion itself seemed to reflect the family's distress. Rooms that had once hosted elegant dinner parties and business gatherings stood empty and unused. The grand piano in the music room gathered dust, its keys silent since the day Catherine had played lullabies for the boys. The library, where James had once spent peaceful evenings reading while Catherine worked on nursery preparations, became a space he avoided entirely. Outside, the gardens continued their seasonal cycles with indifferent beauty. The roses Catherine had planted during her pregnancy bloomed with spectacular color, tended by groundskeepers who worked in shifts to avoid the sound of crying that drifted through open windows. The playground equipment, installed with such hope and anticipation, stood unused beneath protective covers, waiting for children who might never be well enough to enjoy it. James found himself caught between professional obligations that demanded his attention and personal circumstances that made concentration nearly impossible. Conference calls were interrupted by escalating cries from upstairs. Legal documents required multiple readings as his mind wandered to concerns about his son's well-being. Clients began noticing his distraction, though most were too polite to comment directly. His appearance began reflecting the toll of constant stress. The perfectly tailored suits hung looser on his frame as regular meals became irregular snacks grabbed between childcare crises. His usually immaculate grooming showed signs of neglect, ties slightly askew, hair less precisely styled, dark circles under his eyes that no amount of concealer could completely hide. Sleep became a luxury rather than a necessity. Even when the boys managed brief periods of rest, James found himself lying awake, listening for the first signs of renewed crying and mentally rehearsing responses to the next caregiver crisis. His dreams, when they came, were filled with Catherine's voice calling for the boys, with images of the family they should have been, with scenarios where love alone could heal the wounds that seemed to run deeper than any professional expertise could reach. The eighth nanny's departure left James facing a terrible truth. Money and determination, the twin pillars upon which he had built his entire adult life, were proving insufficient against the magnitude of his family's need. 3 small boys, barely old enough to walk, had defeated a parade of highly trained professionals and left one of Manhattan's most successful attorneys feeling more helpless than he had ever imagined possible. Standing in his empty foyer, listening to the sound of crying drift down from the second floor, James Whitmore realized that everything he thought he knew about solving problems had prepared him for every challenge except the one that mattered most. The employment agency's phone calls had stopped coming 3 days ago, their representatives finally admitting defeat after exhausting their database of qualified candidates. James sat in his home office, surrounded by rejection letters and apologetic emails from caregiving services across the tri-state area, each message carrying the same underlying message: the Whitmore assignment had become legendary for all the wrong reasons. Mrs. Rodriguez knocked softly on the door, carrying a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold and a stack of household bills that required his attention. At 62, she had managed estates for some of Connecticut's most prominent families, but nothing in her 4 decades of domestic service had prepared her for the current situation. Her usually immaculate appearance showed signs of wear, graying hair escaping from its customary bun, uniform wrinkled from countless trips up and down the mansion's grand staircase, eyes reflecting the exhaustion that had settled over the entire household like a shroud. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone delivering difficult news. "I've been thinking about our situation with the boys." She paused, glancing toward the ceiling where the familiar sound of crying could be heard through the thick plaster walls. "My sister Isabella works for a family in Westport, and she mentioned something that might be worth considering." James looked up from the contract he had been attempting to review for the past hour, the legal language blurring together into meaningless symbols. His concentration had become unreliable, his mind constantly pulled toward concerns about his son's well-being and the seemingly impossible task of finding someone capable of caring for them. "I'm listening," he said, though his tone carried little hope. After 8 failed attempts, he had begun to wonder if the boys had somehow moved beyond the reach of conventional help. Mrs. Rodriguez settled into the leather chair across from his mahogany desk, her weathered hands folding in her lap with nervous energy. "Isabella told me about a young woman who works in their household, not as a nanny, but as a housekeeper and cook. Maria Santos, I think her name is. The family she works for has 4 children, including twin boys who had some difficulties after their parents went through a messy divorce." She paused, choosing her words carefully.
According to Isabella, this Maria has something special about her. The children in that house were acting out terribly. Tantrums, refusing to eat, barely sleeping. But Maria would sing while she worked, these old songs her grandmother taught her, and somehow the children would calm down. Isabella said it was like magic, the way those boys would stop crying the moment they heard her voice. James felt a familiar skepticism rising in his chest. After months of dealing with highly trained professionals armed with degrees and certifications, the idea that folk songs could succeed where child psychology had failed seemed almost insulting to his intelligence.
Yet desperation had a way of making even the most unlikely solutions seem worth considering. "What kind of songs?" he asked. Though he immediately regretted the question. It sounded foolish. The successful attorney reduced to inquiring about lullabies like some superstitious parent grasping at mystical remedies. Mrs. Rodriguez's expression brightened slightly, the first genuine smile he had seen from her in weeks. "Isabella says they're traditional songs from Maria's family in Guatemala, passed down through generations, songs that mothers and grandmothers sang to comfort children through difficult times. Maria apparently learned them from her abuela, who raised her after her own parents died when she was very young." The mention of early loss caught James's attention more sharply than he had expected. Perhaps someone who had experienced childhood grief might understand something about his son's current state that all the trained professionals had missed. The thought was grasping, but it was the first idea in weeks that didn't feel like a complete dead end. "How old is she?" he asked, his legal training automatically shifting into information-gathering mode. 28, Isabella thinks. She's been working in domestic service since she was 18, mostly with families who have children. She doesn't have formal training as a caregiver, but Isabella says she has this natural way with little ones. Something about her presence just makes them feel safe. Mrs. Rodriguez hesitated before continuing, her voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "There's something else, Mr. Whitmore. Maria is currently between positions. The family she worked for is relocating to California, and she can't make the move because she's caring for her elderly uncle who lives nearby. She's been looking for new employment, but most agencies won't consider domestic staff without childcare credentials for positions involving young children." James found himself considering the possibility with an intensity that surprised him. Every conventional approach had failed spectacularly, leaving his sons trapped in their grief and his household teetering on the edge of complete breakdown. What harm could come from trying something unconventional, especially if traditional methods had proven so thoroughly inadequate? Would she be willing to come for an interview, he asked, already knowing that his question represented a significant shift in his approach to solving the crisis that had consumed his family. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded eagerly, relief flooding her features. "Isabella thinks she would be very interested. The position would be officially as household staff, not a nanny, which might actually work better given the boys' resistance to structured caregiving. Maria could help with cooking and cleaning while naturally interacting with the children, without the pressure of being their designated caregiver." That afternoon, while the triplets dozed fitfully in their cribs during one of their brief respite periods, James found himself standing in the nursery doorway, studying their peaceful faces and wondering if he was making another mistake. The room itself bore witness to the chaos of the past months. Toys scattered across the floor from various caregivers' attempts at distraction, bottles and feeding supplies arranged with military precision that had proven utterly useless. Expensive monitoring equipment that recorded every whimper and cry but offered no solutions. Michael stirred in his sleep, his small fist clenching and unclenching as if fighting battles in his dreams. Matthew's breathing carried the slightly congested sound that had become his signature since the crying began, his body exhausted from the constant emotional strain. Marcus lay perfectly still, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical regularity of someone whose spirit had partially retreated from consciousness. Looking at them, James felt the familiar tightness in his throat that accompanied every moment of clarity about his son's condition. They were not simply difficult babies or children going through an adjustment period. They were three small human beings processing trauma in the only way their developing minds could manage, and every adult intervention had failed to reach them where they needed comfort most. The sound of a car in the driveway drew his attention to the window. Mrs. Rodriguez had arranged for Maria Santos to visit that evening, ostensibly for a standard household staff interview, with the understanding that her interaction with the boys would be observed quietly and without pressure. James made his way downstairs, pausing at the landing to straighten his tie and compose his expression into something approaching professional neutrality. After months of dealing with highly credentialed caregivers who had arrived with comprehensive plans and departed with detailed explanations of their failures, he found himself uncertain how to approach someone whose qualifications consisted primarily of family songs and natural intuition. The doorbell's chimes echoed through the foyer with unusual resonance, as if the house itself was holding its breath in anticipation. Mrs. Rodriguez hurried to answer, her footsteps quick and light with an energy that had been absent for weeks. The woman who entered the mansion's grand foyer bore little resemblance to the parade of professional caregivers who had preceded her. Maria Santos was petite, perhaps 5 feet 3 inches tall, with black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and clothing that spoke of practicality rather than fashion. Her dress was navy blue cotton, clean and pressed but clearly purchased from a department store rather than a boutique. Her shoes were sensible flats, the kind worn by someone who spent long hours on her feet. But it was her face that immediately caught James's attention. Maria's features carried a warmth that seemed to emanate from somewhere deeper than surface politeness. Her brown eyes held an alertness that suggested intelligence tempered by experience, and her smile, though slightly nervous, conveyed genuine kindness rather than professional courtesy. "Whitmore," she said, extending her hand with a grip that was firm but not aggressive, "thank you for meeting with me. Mrs. Rodriguez has told me about your family's situation, and I want to help if I can." Her English carried a slight accent that softened the consonants and added musicality to her words. James found himself listening not just to her meaning, but to the rhythm of her speech, wondering if this was connected to the singing ability that had supposedly calmed other children. "Please come into the living room," he said, gesturing toward the formal sitting area where he had conducted the previous 8 interviews. "Mrs. Rodriguez tells me you have experience working with families who have young children." They settled into the arrangement that had become familiar, James in his leather armchair, the applicant on the sofa across from him, Mrs. Rodriguez hovering nearby with the practiced invisibility of experienced domestic staff. But unlike the previous interviews, where candidates had immediately begun discussing their credentials and philosophies, Maria seemed content to wait for his questions while taking in the details of her surroundings. "Your previous position was with a family in Westport," James began, falling back on the safe territory of employment history. "Yes, the Harrison family. 4 children, ages 3 to 12. I worked for them for almost 3 years, until Mr. Harrison's company transferred him to Los Angeles." Maria's voice carried genuine affection as she spoke about her former employers. "Beautiful children, but they went through a difficult time when their parents were having marriage problems. The household became very tense, and the children began acting out in ways that were hard for everyone." James leaned forward slightly, his interest sharpening. "How did you handle that situation?" Maria's expression grew thoughtful, as if she was carefully considering how to explain something that didn't easily translate into words. "I didn't try to fix anything, really. The children were hurting, and they needed to know that their feelings were understood. While I worked, cooking, cleaning, organizing, I would sing the songs my grandmother taught me. Not performance singing, just background music, like a radio playing softly." She paused, her hands moving expressively as she searched for the right words. "The songs are very old, from my family in Guatemala. They tell stories about children who overcome difficult times, about grandmothers who protect their families, about hope surviving even when everything seems dark. I think children understand these themes, even when they don't speak the language." "And the Harrison children responded to this?" James asked, though he was already beginning to understand why Mrs. Rodriguez had been so enthusiastic about the recommendation. "Gradually, yes. The youngest boy, Tommy, started following me around the house while I worked. At first he would just listen, then he began asking questions about the songs. His sister Sarah would sit nearby during her homework, claiming she needed the kitchen table for better light, but really she was listening too." Maria's smile grew more confident as she continued. "The older boys were more resistant at first, but even they started appearing in whatever room I was cleaning, finding reasons to be nearby. After a few weeks, Mrs. Harrison told me that the children's behavior had improved dramatically. They were sleeping better, eating more regularly, and the tantrums had mostly stopped. James felt a stirring of something he hadn't experienced in months, not quite hope, but a lessening of the absolute despair that had become his constant companion. Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned that you learned these songs from your grandmother. Yes, my abuela Elena. She raised me after my parents died in an earthquake when I was 7. Maria's voice carried no self-pity, just the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had processed childhood trauma and emerged stronger. Those were very difficult years, and I was angry about losing my parents, confused about why I couldn't live in my old house anymore, scared about what would happen to me. She looked directly at James, her expression conveying understanding that went beyond professional sympathy. Abuela Elena couldn't bring my parents back or make the fear go away completely, but she could sing to me. Every night, while she cooked dinner or mended clothes, or prepared for the next day, she would sing these old songs. They became like a safe place inside the music, where nothing bad could touch me while the songs lasted. The description resonated with something deep in James's chest, a recognition of the kind of comfort his sons desperately needed, but that no professional caregiver had been able to provide. Here was someone who understood grief from the inside, who had found healing through something as simple and ancient as family songs passed down through generations. As if summoned by some invisible signal, the sound of crying began to drift down from the second floor. It started with Marcus's distinctive whimper, quickly joined by Matthew's more aggressive protests, and finally escalating to include Michael's angry sobs. The familiar symphony of distress that had become the mansion's constant soundtrack filled the living room, causing Mrs. Rodriguez to wince apologetically. James felt his shoulders tense automatically, the conditioned response to his son's cries that had developed over months of helplessness. He began to rise from his chair, preparing to excuse himself for another futile attempt at comfort, when Maria spoke quietly. "May I?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the crying. Sometimes it helps when they hear an unfamiliar voice, someone who isn't connected to their previous experiences with disappointment. James hesitated, torn between protectiveness and desperation. Every instinct told him to shield his sons from another potential failure, another well-meaning adult who would ultimately prove unable to reach them. But something in Maria's calm demeanor suggested that she understood the magnitude of what she was offering. "They've been very resistant to strangers," he said, the understatement feeling inadequate to describe the boys' complete rejection of every caregiver who had attempted to help them. "I understand," Maria replied, already moving toward the staircase with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to navigating household crises. "I won't try to pick them up or change anything about their routine. I'll just be nearby, in case they're curious about something new." James followed her up the grand staircase, Mrs. Rodriguez trailing behind with the anxious expression of someone who had staked her reputation on this recommendation. The crying grew louder as they approached the nursery, the sound echoing off the high ceilings and hardwood floors with an intensity that seemed to vibrate through the mansion's very foundations. The nursery door stood open, revealing a scene that had become heartbreakingly familiar. 3 cribs arranged in a semicircle, each containing a small boy whose distress had moved beyond tears into something that sounded like grief itself. Michael stood gripping the rails of his crib, his face red and swollen from crying, his small body shaking with the force of his sobs. Matthew had thrown himself down on his mattress, kicking his legs and pounding his fists against the bedding with desperate fury. Marcus sat in the corner of his crib, his back against the rails, crying with the exhausted persistence of someone who had given up hope of comfort but couldn't stop expressing his pain. Maria paused in the doorway, taking in the scene with the calm assessment of someone evaluating a complex situation. She didn't rush forward or begin speaking in the artificially cheerful tones that most caregivers adopted when confronted with crying children. Instead, she simply entered the room and found a position near the window, far enough from the cribs to avoid seeming intrusive but close enough for her presence to be acknowledged. "Hola, pequeñas," she said softly, her voice carrying easily over the crying without competing with it. "My name is Maria, and I came to visit your beautiful house today." Her words carried a melody even in simple speech, the accent lending a musical quality that was somehow different from the clinical tones the boys had grown accustomed to hearing from caregivers. She made no move toward the cribs, instead settling onto the window seat with the patient posture of someone prepared to wait as long as necessary. "I was just telling your papa about my abuela Elena, who taught me songs when I was little like you," she continued, her voice maintaining the same gentle, unhurried cadence. "She used to say that music was like a bridge between hearts, a way for people to understand each other even when words weren't enough." James watched from the doorway, hardly daring to breathe as he observed his son's reactions. The crying continued unabated, but something subtle had shifted in the room's atmosphere. Michael's grip on the crib rails had loosened slightly, though his sobbing continued. Matthew's kicking had become less violent, more rhythmic, as if responding to some underlying beat in Maria's voice. Marcus had lifted his head slightly, though tears still streamed down his cheeks. Maria began to hum, so softly that at first James wasn't certain he was hearing anything beyond his own wishful thinking. The melody was unlike anything he had ever heard, not a recognizable lullaby or children's song, but something that seemed to carry centuries of comfort within its simple phrases. The tune repeated with variations, each cycle adding new nuances while maintaining a hypnotic consistency that seemed to create its own atmosphere within the room. Gradually, imperceptibly at first, the melody grew more distinct. Maria's humming evolved into wordless singing, her voice rising and falling with the organic rhythm of breathing or heartbeats. The sound seemed to fill the nursery not with volume but with presence, as if the air itself had become more nurturing. Michael was the first to respond visibly. His sobbing decreased in intensity, though tears continued to flow down his cheeks. His small hands relaxed their death grip on the crib rails, and his body ceased the rigid trembling that had accompanied his most distressed episodes. He remained standing, but his posture shifted from desperation to something approaching curiosity. Matthew's aggressive movements slowed and eventually stopped, his small body settling into stillness as he listened to the unfamiliar sounds. His breathing, which had been quick and shallow with crying, began to deepen and regularize. Though tears still ran down his face, the angry edge had left his expression, replaced by the focused attention of someone trying to understand something new and potentially significant. Marcus showed the most dramatic change. The listless withdrawal that had characterized his recent behavior gave way to alert engagement. He pulled himself to standing, gripping the crib rails not with desperate need, but with the purposeful motion of someone seeking a better vantage point. His crying diminished to occasional hiccups, and his eyes fixed on Maria with an intensity that James had not seen from him in months. Maria continued singing, her voice now carrying words in what James assumed was Spanish, though the language seemed less important than the emotion conveyed through melody and rhythm. The songs appeared to tell stories, rising and falling patterns suggested narrative arcs, while repeated phrases created familiar anchors within the unfamiliar linguistic landscape. As minutes passed, an extraordinary transformation took place in the nursery. The boys' crying didn't stop immediately, but it evolved from expressions of inconsolable distress to something more like communication. Their tears continued, but the desperate quality began to fade, replaced by what seemed almost like relief at finally being understood by someone who spoke their emotional language. Maria sang of children who traveled long journeys to find their families, of grandmothers who protected little ones through dark nights, of morning sunshine that always returned after storms. Though James couldn't translate the specific words, the themes were universal enough to transcend language barriers, and their message of comfort and eventual healing seemed to reach his sons in ways that months of professional intervention had failed to achieve. By the time Maria's songs reached their natural conclusion, roughly 20 minutes after she had begun, the nursery had transformed into a different kind of space entirely. The boys were no longer crying, though they remained alert and watchful. Michael sat in his crib, his attention completely focused on the woman by the window. Matthew had pulled himself to standing and was gripping the rails while leaning as close to Maria as his crib would allow. Marcus stood in the corner nearest to her, his small hands reaching through the slats as if trying to bridge the distance between them. "Otra vez," Marcus said suddenly, his voice hoarse from crying but clear enough to be understood. Again, James felt his heart stop. His youngest son had just spoken his first clear word in months, and it was a request for more of the music that had somehow reached him where nothing else could. Maria smiled and began another song, this one different from the first, but carrying the same underlying message of comfort and continuity. The boys settled into listening positions, their small bodies relaxed in ways James had not seen since before Catherine's death. Standing in the doorway, James felt tears running down his own cheeks for the first time since the funeral. Not tears of grief or frustration, but tears of recognition. After months of watching his sons slip further away from the world of the living, he was witnessing their first tentative steps back toward connection and hope. Mrs. Rodriguez touched his arm gently, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "I think," she whispered, "we may have found our answer." As Maria continued singing, the mansion's atmosphere seemed to shift in ways that went beyond the immediate quiet in the nursery. For the first time since Catherine's death, the house felt like it might someday become a home again. The evening that followed represented a turning point that none of them could have anticipated when the day began. After Maria's impromptu session with the boys, James invited her to stay for dinner, ostensibly to continue their employment discussion, but really because the thought of her leaving while the boys remained calm felt like tempting fate. Mrs. Rodriguez prepared a simple meal, and they ate in the informal dining room rather than the grand formal space where James usually conducted business meals. The change of venue felt significant, as if acknowledging that this was not a typical employment negotiation, but something more personal and more important. Throughout the meal, they could hear occasional sounds from upstairs, not crying, but the normal noises of children playing quietly in their cribs, talking to themselves in the babbled language that had been absent for months. The difference was so stark that James found himself pausing mid-sentence to listen, hardly daring to believe that the transformation was real and lasting. "The songs," he said finally, setting down his fork and looking directly at Maria. "How do you know which ones to choose?" Maria considered the question carefully, her expression thoughtful. "It's not really about choosing exactly. The songs choose themselves, based on what the children need to hear. Tonight your boys needed to know that they weren't alone, that someone understood their sadness, and that sadness is not permanent." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "In my culture, we believe that children are born knowing things that adults forget. They understand loss and love and hope without needing explanations. Sometimes they just need someone to sing those truths back to them in a language their hearts can recognize." James found himself nodding, though he wasn't entirely sure he understood the mechanism she was describing. What mattered was that it worked, that his sons had responded to Maria's approach when nothing else had reached them. "If I offered you a position here," he said, the words feeling both momentous and inevitable, "what would you see as your primary responsibilities?" "Taking care of your family," Maria replied without hesitation, "cooking, cleaning, maintaining the household, and being available when the boys need comfort. Not as their nanny or therapist, just as someone who cares about their well-being and knows how to help them feel safe." The simplicity of her answer contrasted sharply with the detailed care plans and behavioral modification strategies that previous candidates had proposed. James was beginning to understand that the boy's needs might be far more fundamental than he had realized, not complex psychological intervention, but basic human connection offered by someone who understood pain and healing from personal experience. There would be living accommodations, he said, his legal training automatically shifting into practical considerations. We have a comfortable apartment above the garage, completely private with its own entrance. The salary would be competitive with domestic management positions in similar households. Maria smiled, and for the first time since their meeting began, she looked truly relaxed. Mr. Whitmore, I would be honored to work for your family. But I want you to understand that what I offer isn't a cure or a quick fix. Healing from loss takes time, especially for children so young. There will be difficult days, setbacks, moments when the songs aren't enough. Her honesty was refreshing after months of dealing with caregivers who had promised comprehensive solutions and definitive timelines. James found himself trusting her measured approach more than the confident assertions of more credentialed applicants. "When could you start?" he asked. "Tomorrow, if you need me to," Maria replied. "I've already completed my obligations to the Harrison family, and my belongings are packed. I've been staying with my uncle while looking for new employment, so I can relocate quickly if necessary." That night, after Maria had left to collect her things and prepare for the move, James stood once again in the nursery doorway. The boys were sleeping more peacefully than they had in months, their breathing deep and regular, their faces relaxed in ways that spoke of genuine rest rather than exhausted collapse. For the first time since Catherine's death, James allowed himself to imagine a future where his sons might be happy again. The image was fragile, tentative, but it existed in his mind as a possibility rather than an impossible dream. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and Maria's warning about setbacks and difficult days was undoubtedly accurate. But tonight, listening to the sound of his children sleeping peacefully, James felt something he had almost forgotten was possible: hope. Maria's first week at the Whitmore estate unfolded like pages in a storybook that nobody dared believe could have a happy ending. She moved into the apartment above the garage with minimal fanfare, carrying only 2 suitcases and a wooden box that contained her most precious possessions: photographs of her grandmother, handwritten recipe cards, and a collection of sheet music with lyrics written in her abuela's careful script. The apartment itself was more luxurious than any living space Maria had ever called her own. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the estate's formal gardens, hardwood floors gleamed with recent polishing, and the kitchen was equipped with professional-grade appliances that seemed almost too beautiful to use. But what mattered most to Maria was the perfect view of the main house, allowing her to see the nursery windows and know instinctively when her presence might be needed. Her daily routine began before dawn, not because anyone required such early hours, but because childhood habits formed during years of helping her grandmother prepare for the day died hard. She would dress quietly, make herself a simple breakfast of coffee and toast, then slip into the main house through the service entrance that Mrs. Rodriguez had shown her the previous evening. The kitchen became her command center, though she moved through it with the respectful awareness of someone who understood that every household had its established rhythms. Mrs. Rodriguez had been gracious about sharing responsibilities, but Maria sensed the older woman's relief at having someone to help shoulder the burden of managing a household in crisis. The boys' breakfast presented the first real test of whether the previous evening's success had been an anomaly or the beginning of genuine progress. For months, meal times had been battlegrounds where the simplest acts of nourishment became exercises in frustration and failure. High chairs remained empty while the boys refused to eat, bottles were thrown across rooms with surprising accuracy, and pureed foods ended up decorating expensive wallpaper more often than reaching small mouths. Maria approached the morning feeding with careful strategy, understanding that rushing or forcing the issue could undo whatever fragile connection she had established. She prepared the boys' bottles with the precision Mrs. Rodriguez had taught her, warming the formula to exactly the right temperature, then carried them upstairs with soft footsteps that announced her presence without startling anyone awake. The nursery was bathed in golden morning light that streamed through windows Catherine had specifically positioned to catch the sunrise. Michael, Matthew and Marcus were awake but quiet in their cribs, a state that would have been impossible just days earlier. They watched her enter with the alert attention of children who had learned to be wary of adult intentions but were willing to reserve judgment. "Buenos dias, pequeños príncipes," Maria said softly, setting the bottles on the changing table and moving to raise the window shades fully. "Good morning, little princes. I brought breakfast, but first we need some music to help our day begin properly." She began humming while she arranged the bottles, the melody different from the previous evening's songs but carrying the same underlying sense of security and continuity. This tune was brighter, more awakening, like musical sunshine designed to ease the transition from sleep to wakefulness. Michael responded first, pulling himself to standing and bouncing slightly in his crib, his body language expressing interest rather than demand. Matthew crawled to the corner nearest Maria and sat watching her movements with the focused attention of someone studying something important. Marcus remained lying down but turned his head to track her voice, his expression peaceful rather than withdrawn. When Maria lifted Michael from his crib, he didn't stiffen or pull away as he had with every caregiver since his mother's death. Instead, he settled against her shoulder with the trusting weight of a child who felt safe. The simple act of being held without resistance represented a breakthrough that months of professional intervention had failed to achieve. She carried him to the rocking chair by the window, continuing her gentle humming while she offered him his bottle. For the first time in weeks, Michael accepted nourishment without protest, his small hands gripping the bottle with purposeful intent rather than throwing it away in frustrated rejection. Matthew and Marcus watched this interaction with growing interest, their own desire for similar comfort becoming evident in the way they reached through their crib slats and made soft sounds that were clearly attempts to gain Maria's attention. She divided her time between the three boys with natural instinct, feeding Michael while singing to all three, then moving to Matthew while keeping up a stream of gentle Spanish that seemed to create a cocoon of comfort around the entire room. "Tu mamá te ama mucho," she whispered to Matthew as he drank his bottle, her voice carrying absolute conviction. "Your mama loves you very much. Está en las estrellas ahora, cantándote desde el cielo." She's in the stars now, singing to you from heaven. James appeared in the doorway during Marcus's feeding, drawn by sounds he hadn't heard from the nursery in months, the soft murmur of contented babies and gentle adult conversation, punctuated by Maria's melodic voice weaving in and out of Spanish and English like a bilingual lullaby. He stood transfixed, watching his youngest son accept comfort and nourishment from someone who had been a stranger less than 24 hours earlier. The sight of his children eating peacefully, their small bodies relaxed against Maria's arms, their faces showing curiosity and engagement rather than distress, struck James with an emotion so powerful it threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. These were his sons as he remembered them from before the tragedy, alert, interactive, responsive to care and attention. "They're eating," he said, the words carrying weight far beyond their simple meaning. Maria looked up from Marcus, her expression warm with understanding. "See, they're very hungry boys who have been too sad to eat properly." Sometimes when children lose their mama, they forget how to accept love from other people. But love is like music, it finds a way into hearts, even when the mind tries to keep it out. Over the following days, Maria established routines that worked with the boys' emotional needs rather than against them. She didn't attempt to impose strict schedules or behavioral modifications. Instead, she created an environment where healing could occur naturally, through consistent presence and the ancient comfort of songs that had soothed generations of children through difficult times. Breakfast became a musical performance, with Maria singing counting songs in Spanish while the boys ate, turning the simple act of nourishment into something approaching celebration. "Uno, dos, tres pequeños hermanos,"
comiendo su desayuno con amor. 1, 2, 3 little brothers, eating their breakfast with love. Bath time transformed from a daily struggle into a water play session, accompanied by songs about little fish swimming in warm rivers and children splashing in mountain streams. The boys began to laugh during their baths, the sound echoing off bathroom tiles like bells announcing their return to joy.
Even diaper changes, previously occasions for tears and resistance, became opportunities for gentle interaction as Maria sang silly songs about baby animals and made faces that sent the boys into giggles that seemed to surprise them with their own capacity for happiness. James began adjusting his schedule to witness these small miracles, finding excuses to pass by the nursery during feeding times or linger in hallways where he could hear Maria's voice creating pockets of peace throughout his previously chaotic household. He watched Michael clap his hands when Maria sang his favorite song about a little boy who befriended the moon. He observed Matthew attempting to sing along with wordless babbling that somehow matched the rhythm perfectly. Most remarkably, he witnessed Marcus smiling, genuine expressions of pleasure that transformed his small face from the mask of grief it had worn for months. The changes weren't limited to the boys. Mrs. Rodriguez began humming Maria's melodies while she worked, the traditional songs from Guatemala blending with her own Mexican heritage to create a musical backdrop that made the entire house feel more alive. The other household staff, previously tense and stressed by the constant crying, began to move through their duties with renewed energy and purpose. James himself felt the transformation in ways both subtle and profound. Conference calls no longer required noise-canceling headphones to block out crying from upstairs. Legal briefs could be reviewed without constant interruption by childcare crises. Most importantly, he began to look forward to coming home each evening, anticipating the sounds of contentment rather than dreading another night of helpless frustration. One evening in Maria's second week, James arrived home to find a scene that stopped him in his tracks. The living room had been transformed into an impromptu concert hall, with Maria sitting on the Persian rug surrounded by the three boys, all of them clapping and swaying to a lively song about dancing chickens. Michael was attempting to stand and bounce to the rhythm, Matthew was crawling in circles around Maria while giggling, and Marcus was sitting pressed against her side, his small hand resting on her arm as if anchoring himself to the source of all this joy. "Papa," Matthew called out, the word clear and enthusiastic, another first word that marked his emerging return to communication and connection. James sank to his knees and opened his arms, hardly daring to believe what happened next. All three boys moved toward him with the eager motion of children seeking affection from someone they trusted and loved. Michael reached him first, small arms wrapping around his neck with genuine warmth. Matthew crawled into his lap with determined purpose. Marcus, always the most cautious, approached slowly but deliberately, ultimately settling against James's side with a contentment that spoke volumes about his emotional recovery. "They wanted to wait for you," Maria said softly, her voice carrying quiet pride in the boys' progress. "We were practicing a welcome home song, but I think they prefer this kind of greeting." Holding his three sons while they babbled and laughed and showed him the toys they had been playing with, James felt a completion he hadn't experienced since Catherine's death. Not the same wholeness they had known as a family of five, but a different kind of healing that honored their loss while creating space for new forms of love and connection. That night, after Maria had sung the boys to sleep with lullabies about mothers who watched over their children from heaven, James found himself walking through rooms that no longer felt like a mausoleum of failed hopes. The house had regained its purpose as a home, filled with the sounds and energy of a family learning to live again. He knocked softly on the door of Maria's apartment, finding her sitting at her small kitchen table with a cup of tea and one of her grandmother's recipe cards, planning menus that would appeal to increasingly adventurous young appetites. "I need to thank you," he began, then stopped, realizing that no words were adequate for what she had given his family. Maria looked up with the gentle smile that had become familiar and precious to everyone in the household. "Mr. Whitmore, you don't need to thank me.
Your boys are teaching me as much as I'm teaching them. They're showing me that healing is possible, that families can be rebuilt in new ways while still honoring what came before." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "But I want you to understand something important. The boys are doing well now, but they will always carry the memory of losing their mother. As they grow older, they'll need to process that loss in different ways. What we're building now is a foundation of security and love that will help them navigate those challenges when they come." James nodded, appreciating her honesty and her long-term perspective on his son's emotional development. "What do you think they'll need as they get older?" "They'll need to know their mother's story," Maria said without hesitation. "They'll want to understand who she was, how much she loved them, why she had to leave them even though it wasn't her choice. They'll need pictures and memories and stories that help them feel connected to her, not separated by her absence." The suggestion initially felt painful, like picking at a wound that had barely begun to heal. But as James considered her words, he began to understand that avoiding Catherine's memory hadn't protected his sons from grief. It had simply left them to process their loss without the comfort of understanding their mother's love. "How would we do that?" he asked, his legal mind already shifting into planning mode. "Start with small things," Maria suggested. "Pictures in their room, stories about what she was like when she was carrying them, her favorite songs or foods or places. Let them know that talking about Mama is not just allowed but encouraged. Show them that remembering her brings joy, not just sadness." Over the following weeks, James began the delicate process of reintroducing Catherine's presence into their daily lives in ways that honored her memory while supporting his son's ongoing healing. He had photographs reprinted and framed for the nursery, Catherine reading during her pregnancy, Catherine painting the nursery walls, Catherine holding each boy for the first time in the hospital. Maria helped facilitate these introductions with characteristic gentleness, singing songs about mamas who lived in children's hearts and telling stories about the beautiful lady who had loved 3 little boys so much that she asked the angels to help other people take care of them when she couldn't be there anymore. The boys responded to these additions with interest rather than distress, pointing to pictures of Catherine and babbling questions that Maria answered with patient elaboration. Michael would touch Catherine's photograph gently, his small fingers tracing her face with recognition. Matthew brought toys to show Catherine's picture, as if including her in his play. Marcus developed a habit of blowing kisses to her photograph before nap time, a ritual that brought tears to James's eyes every time he witnessed it. As autumn deepened into winter, the Whitmore household settled into rhythms that felt both new and eternal. The boys thrived under Maria's care, their developmental progress accelerating as their emotional stability improved. They began walking within days of each other, their confidence growing alongside their physical abilities. Their vocabularies expanded rapidly, mixing English and Spanish in creative combinations that delighted everyone who heard them. James restructured his practice to maintain better work-life balance, understanding now that professional success meant nothing if it came at the cost of his relationship with his sons. He began working from home more frequently, scheduling client meetings around bedtime stories and family dinners. His partners initially expressed concern about his reduced office presence, but his improved focus and emotional stability actually enhanced his performance on the cases that mattered most. The mansion itself seemed to exhale with relief, its rooms filling with the sounds and energy of a family learning to flourish again. The piano in the music room came out of retirement as Maria began teaching the boys simple songs they could play with one finger. The formal dining room hosted finger painting sessions that would have horrified an interior decorator, but perfectly suited a household prioritizing healing over perfection. Christmas arrived with a poignancy that mixed grief and celebration in ways James had not anticipated. This would be the boys' second Christmas, but their first one they would remember, and their first without Catherine. He struggled with how to mark the holiday in ways that honored their loss while creating new traditions they could build upon. Maria solved the dilemma with characteristic wisdom, suggesting they create a special ornament for Catherine that would have a place of honor on their tree every year. She helped the boys make handprint ornaments in clay, tiny impressions of their growing hands that would remind them of this Christmas when they were older and trying to remember what it felt like to be learning to live without their mother. Christmas morning brought gifts chosen with care for children discovering the joy of play after months of emotional withdrawal. The boys tore wrapping paper with infectious enthusiasm while Maria and James watched from the sofa, their shared pride in the children's happiness, creating a sense of family that transcended traditional definitions. "Mama," Marcus said suddenly, pointing to Catherine's ornament on the tree. Then he looked at Maria and added, "Mama Maria," his small voice making a distinction that acknowledged both the mother he had lost and the maternal figure who had helped him heal. James felt his eyes fill with tears at the unconscious wisdom of his youngest son's declaration. Maria had not replaced Catherine, nobody could do that, but she had created a new form of maternal love that complemented rather than competed with Catherine's memory, showing the boys that hearts were capable of holding multiple forms of love without diminishing any of them. As winter moved towards spring, James began to contemplate the future with genuine optimism for the first time since Catherine's death. His sons were thriving, their laughter filling rooms that had known only grief for too long. His household had regained its purpose and energy, centered around the needs of 3 growing boys who were learning to embrace life again. One evening in late March, as he tucked the boys into their cribs for the night, Michael looked up at him with eyes that sparkled with mischief and intelligence. "Papa, sing," Michael requested, his vocabulary now sophisticated enough to make specific demands. James realized he had never sung to his sons, had never even attempted the musical comfort that had proven so essential to their healing. "I don't know the songs that Maria sings," he said apologetically. "Papa song," Matthew insisted from his crib, apparently having no doubt that their father possessed hidden musical abilities. Maria appeared in the doorway, drawn by the conversation. "Every parent has songs in their heart," she said gently. "Maybe not grandmother songs like mine, but songs that come from love for their children." With tremendous self-consciousness and no small amount of terror, James began to sing. His voice was untrained and uncertain, carrying none of the melodic beauty of Maria's traditional songs. But he sang "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" with all the love in his heart, watching his sons' faces light up with delight at this new form of attention from their father. By the song's end, all 3 boys were clapping and calling for "Mas, Mas, more, more," their enthusiasm for their father's musical debut overwhelming any concerns about technical quality. Standing in the doorway, Maria smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had witnessed healing come full circle. The family she had found in crisis was learning not just to survive their loss, but to build new forms of joy on the foundation of love that survived even death. As spring blossomed around the estate, bringing new life to gardens Catherine had planned but never seen in full bloom, the Whitmore household settled into patterns of contentment that felt both miraculous and sustainable. 3 little boys who had once seemed unreachable were thriving under the care of people who understood that love came in many forms, that healing happened in its own time, and that sometimes the most profound solutions were also the simplest. In the evening quiet, with his son sleeping peacefully, and Maria humming softly in the kitchen below, James Whitmore finally understood what he had learned through the darkest period of his life, that families could be rebuilt in ways that honored what came before while creating space for new forms of love, and that sometimes the most important healing happened not through complex interventions, but through the ancient comfort of human connection expressed in songs as old as time itself. 2 years had transformed the Whitmore estate from a monument to grief into a testament to resilience and love's capacity to bloom in the most unlikely circumstances. The boys, now nearly 4 years old, raced through the mansion's corridors with the boundless energy of children who had learned that their world was safe, that the adults in their lives could be trusted, and that joy was not a temporary visitor, but a permanent resident in their home.
Michael had grown into a natural leader among his brothers, his confident personality emerging as his emotional security strengthened. He spoke in complex sentences that mixed English and Spanish with the unconscious fluency of a child raised in two languages, often serving as translator when his brother's attempts at communication fell short of adult understanding. His favorite activity had become helping Maria in the kitchen, standing on a sturdy step stool, while she guided his small hands through the motions of kneading bread or stirring soup. Matthew had channeled his adventurous spirit into exploration of every corner of the estate, his curiosity leading him to discover hiding places in the garden, secret passages between rooms, and the fascinating world of insects that inhabited the carefully maintained grounds. He collected beetles and butterflies with the dedication of a serious naturalist, presenting his finds to anyone willing to admire his discoveries while chattering in rapid bilingual commentary about their colors and behaviors. Marcus, always the most sensitive of the three, had developed into the family's unofficial emotional barometer, his intuitive understanding of feelings making him the first to offer comfort when someone seemed sad or the first to share excitement when good news arrived. He had inherited his mother's gentle nature, apparent in the way he cared for injured birds found in the garden, or insisted on saying good night to Catherine's photograph each evening before accepting his bedtime story. The transformation extended far beyond the children. James had discovered aspects of fatherhood that his grief had previously hidden from him, finding profound satisfaction in bedtime rituals, weekend adventures, and the countless small moments that comprised daily life with three energetic preschoolers. His law practice had evolved to accommodate his changed priorities, with a more selective client list and partnerships that recognized his need for work-life integration rather than the all-consuming ambition that had once defined his career. Maria had become far more than a household employee. She was family in every sense that mattered, her presence woven so completely into their daily rhythms that the boys couldn't imagine life without her songs, her stories, her patient guidance through childhood's inevitable challenges. She had earned James's complete trust and the children's absolute devotion, her wisdom and warmth creating the foundation upon which their healing had been built. The anniversary of Catherine's death no longer loomed as a day of unbearable sadness, but had evolved into something more complex, a time for remembering her love, acknowledging their loss, and celebrating how far they had traveled on their journey toward wholeness. This year James had planned something special, a gesture that would honor Catherine's memory while affirming the family they had become. On a crisp October morning, with autumn leaves creating a carpet of gold and crimson across the estate grounds, James gathered his sons in the living room for what he described as an important family meeting. The boys settled onto the Persian rug with the expectant attention of children who had learned that important family meetings usually involved good news rather than restrictions or disappointments. "Today is a very special day," James began, his voice carrying the weight of significance without the shadow of sorrow that had once accompanied any mention of their mother. "It's the day we remember Mama Catherine and talk about how much she loved all of us." Michael nodded solemnly, his 4-year-old face showing the gravity appropriate to the moment. "Mama Catherine is in the stars," he said, repeating the explanation that had helped him understand her absence. "She watches us from heaven." "That's right," James confirmed. "And today I want to show you something very special that Mama Catherine left for you, something she made before you were born because she knew how much she would love you." He produced a wooden box that the boys had never seen before, its surface polished to a warm glow and decorated with delicate carvings of musical notes and tiny birds. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that still carried a faint trace of Catherine's favorite perfume, were 3 identical journals bound in soft leather, each one inscribed with a name in Catherine's careful handwriting. "She wrote in these every day while you were growing in her tummy," James explained, his voice steady despite the emotion threading through his words. "She wrote about how excited she was to meet you, about the things she wanted to teach you, about how much she already loved you before you were even born." Marcus reached for his journal with reverent care, his small fingers tracing his name on the cover as if touching something precious and fragile.
Matthew bounced with excitement, eager to see what secrets his book contained. Michael looked back and forth between his father and the journals, his natural leadership instinct sensing that this moment required special understanding. "Can you read them to us, Papa?" Michael asked, his question carrying the assumption that his father would know how to share this treasure appropriately. James opened Michael's journal to the first entry, dated 7 months before the boy's birth, and began to read in a voice that carried love across the bridge between past and present. "Today I felt you moving for the first time, my precious Michael. You're going to be such a strong boy, I can tell already. I can't wait to hold you and sing you lullabies and show you all the beautiful things in this world." The boys listened with rapt attention as their father read entry after entry, their mother's voice reaching them through words written in love and hope. Catherine had documented her dreams for their future, her plans for bedtime stories and birthday parties, her certainty that they would grow up to be kind and brave and wonderful. Some entries made them laugh, like Catherine's speculation about whether Matthew would be a professional athlete based on his energetic kicks, or her observation that Marcus seemed to quiet down whenever she played classical music. Others brought gentle tears, like her promise that she would always be proud of them no matter what they chose to do with their lives, or her certainty that they would grow up knowing they were deeply loved. When James finished reading, the room held a different quality of silence than any they had experienced before. This wasn't the heavy quiet of grief or the tentative hush of early healing, but the peaceful stillness of understanding, of connection that transcended physical presence. "She really loved us a lot," Marcus said softly, his observation carrying the wonder of a child discovering something remarkable. "More than all the stars in the sky," James confirmed, echoing one of Catherine's favorite phrases. "And that love doesn't go away just because she can't be here with us anymore. It stays in your hearts forever." Maria, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, stepped forward with something in her hands, a guitar that the family had never seen before, its wood worn smooth by years of use and its strings gleaming with recent tuning. "This was my abuela's guitar," she said, settling onto the rug beside the boys. "She taught me that the best way to honor people we love is to share the gifts they gave us. Your mama gave you love, and my abuela gave me music. Today I thought we could put them together." She began to play, her fingers finding chords that seemed to carry the weight of generations, melodies that had comforted children through centuries of joy and sorrow. But instead of her traditional Guatemalan songs, she played a tune that James recognized, "You Are My Sunshine," the song Catherine had hummed while decorating the nursery, the song she had planned to sing to her children during quiet moments they would never share. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine," Maria sang, her voice carrying the melody Catherine had loved. "You make me happy when skies are gray." The boys joined in with the enthusiasm of children who had learned that music was a safe space where all emotions were welcome. Their voices blended with Maria's in imperfect harmony, creating something more beautiful than technical precision could achieve. As the song continued, James felt a presence that was both memory and something more tangible, as if Catherine's love had found a way to join their circle through the voices of their children and the woman who had helped them learn to sing again. The boundary between past and present seemed to dissolve, creating a moment where loss and healing, memory and hope, grief and joy existed together without contradiction. When the music faded, Michael looked up at his father with eyes that sparkled with sudden inspiration. "Papa, can we plant something for Mama Catherine? Something that will grow every year so we can see how much our love for her grows too." The suggestion struck James as perfect in its simplicity and profound in its symbolism. That afternoon, the entire family, James, the 3 boys, Maria, and Mrs. Rodriguez, gathered in the section of the garden where Catherine had planned to create a butterfly sanctuary. Together they planted a young oak tree, its small trunk promising decades of growth and shade for future generations. Each boy contributed something to the planting ceremony. Michael carefully poured water around the roots while explaining to the tree that it needed to grow strong like his mama had wanted him to be. Matthew collected the prettiest stones from the garden paths to create a decorative circle around the base, chattering to Catherine's spirit about how she would like the colors he had chosen. Marcus picked wildflowers from the meadow beyond the formal gardens, creating a small bouquet that he placed gently against the trunk. "Every year on this day we'll come back here," James promised, his arms encircling his sons as they admired their work. "We'll see how much the tree has grown, and we'll remember how much our love has grown too." Maria began to sing again, this time one of her grandmother's songs about trees that carried the wishes of children up to the heavens where angels could hear them. The melody seemed to bless their small ceremony, creating a sacred space where memory and hope could coexist peacefully. As evening approached and the boys tired from their emotional day, the family returned to the house for dinner. The dining room had been transformed with candles and flowers, creating an atmosphere of gentle celebration rather than somber remembrance. Mrs. Rodriguez had prepared Catherine's favorite meal, herb-roasted chicken with vegetables from the garden she had planned, turning the anniversary of loss into an occasion for honoring life. During dinner, the boys shared their favorite memories of the day, their excitement about the tree they had planted, their plans for visiting it as it grew. Their chatter filled the room with the sounds of children who understood they were loved, who felt secure in their family, who could speak about loss and love without fear. After the boys were tucked into bed with their mother's journals placed carefully on their nightstands, James found himself in the garden, standing beside the small oak tree they had planted. The evening air carried the scent of autumn roses and the distant sound of Maria's voice as she finished her evening songs for the children. "I hope you can see them," he whispered to the stars, his words carrying across the space between earth and heaven. "They're everything you dreamed they would be, kind and brave and full of joy. Maria has given them the music you would have sung, and they know they're loved beyond measure." A gentle breeze rustled the oak's young leaves, and James chose to interpret it as Catherine's response, her way of letting him know that love transcends physical presence, that families can be rebuilt without forgetting what came before, that healing is possible even after the deepest loss. Walking back toward the house where warm lights glowed in windows and the sounds of his family settling into sleep created a symphony of contentment, James reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 3 years ago he had been a man drowning in grief, unable to reach his sons through the wall of their mutual sorrow. Tonight he was part of a family that honored its loss while embracing its future, that had learned to weave memory and hope into something stronger than either could be alone. The 8 nannies who had been defeated by 3 grieving toddlers had each possessed impressive qualifications and genuine intentions, but what his sons had needed couldn't be found in textbooks or certification programs. They had needed someone who understood that healing begins with connection, that love speaks in many languages, and that sometimes the most profound solutions are also the simplest. Maria's songs had been the bridge that carried them from despair to hope, but the destination had always been love, the love that Catherine had planted in their hearts before they were born, the love that James had rediscovered through learning to be present for his children. The love that Maria had shared freely without expecting anything in return except the privilege of watching a family heal. As James turned off the lights and climbed the stairs toward his own rest, he paused outside the nursery door to listen to the sound that had once seemed impossible. 3 children sleeping peacefully, their breathing deep and regular, their dreams untroubled by the grief that had once consumed their waking hours. In the quiet darkness he could hear the echo of Maria's evening lullabies, the memory of his son's laughter during their tree-planting ceremony, the whisper of wind through young oak leaves that carried promises of growth and renewal. These sounds wove together into a symphony of healing that proved families could survive the impossible, that love was indeed stronger than loss, and that sometimes the greatest miracles came disguised as simple human kindness. The Whitmore estate settled into sleep around its healing family, the mansion's rooms filled not with the echoes of what had been lost, but with the quiet promise of all the tomorrows yet to come. In the apartment above the garage, Maria prepared for another day of sharing her grandmother's gifts with children who had learned to trust in love again. In their beds, 3 boys dreamed of oak trees reaching toward stars where their mother waited, of songs that carried comfort across any distance, of a father who had learned to sing them home. And in the master bedroom, James Whitmore fell asleep with gratitude replacing the grief that had once defined him, knowing that love had indeed found a way to heal what seemed broken beyond repair, one song at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.